we're going to learn about the past tense in Latin. Latin actually has 3 different ways to express the past tense. So does English, although we may not always think of them separately. Today we're going to learn 2 of these ways to express the past tense in Latin, the imperfect. The imperfect tense represents action that is ongoing from the past. In English, we typically use a 2-word verb to express the imperfect tense, or to translate the Latin imperfect tense. For example, I was running from the police. The girls were writing letters. In these sentences, you can see the English verbs use 2 words, was running and were writing, to show the complete verb. This is characteristic of the imperfect tense. Whenever you're translating the imperfect into English, you'll want to use a 2-word English verb. The perfect tense, on the other hand, shows action that is finished, action that is complete, and typically the perfect tense is only a 1-word verb in English. Often, these are verbs that end in ed. He walked, they recited. However, as you can see from the examples I've written here, it is not always a verb ending in ed. He wrote a book. They ran home. You're going to have to use your knowledge of English to best translate the perfect tense into English. Let's have a look at the imperfect and the perfect in English first, before we turn our attention to Latin. I have a whole host of verbs here on the bottom of the screen, and 2 columns, the imperfect and the perfect. I'm going to help you categorize these verbs into these 2 columns. Remember, when we're looking for the imperfect, we're looking for a 2-word verb, and for the perfect, we're looking for usually a 1-word verb. So watch out for those INGs and EDs to help give you a clue as to which tense you're in English. Starting out with he was watching, I see right away that this is a 2-word verb, and my second word ends in ing. That indicates to me that this verb is in the imperfect. He was watching. She loved is a 1-word verb, loved, and it ends in ed, so I can be quite assured that this is in the perfect tense. They were applauding, 2-word verb, imperfect. I laughed, 1-word verb, perfect, and again I see that ed that helps me be doubly sure. I ran, perfect. They called, perfect. They were running, 2-word verb with that ing, imperfect. She was shouting, imperfect. I was waiting for, imperfect. You carried, perfect. You came, perfect. They prayed, perfect. I hope this gives you an indication as to which verbs are imperfect and perfect in English. Try to think of a few more on your own as we continue through the lesson. You'll have lots of chances to practice. Now let's turn to Latin. The imperfect tense in Latin is just like a sheep. All you have to do is add ba. It's very easy to spot the imperfect tense in Latin because it always looks the same. It always has a ba. You can see it right here in all these examples that I've included at the bottom. Very easy to spot. You'll notice that the front of our verb looks the same as it did when we were in the present tense, and that we also have the same endings, t and nt, to indicate singular and plural. All we've added is a ba, which shows us that we are now in the imperfect tense. Porta bat is he was carrying. Plaudabant, they were applauding. We know it's plural because we see the nt. Essentially, a good tactic for the imperfect is to read your verb backwards. We see the t, so we know it's singular, she. We see the ba, so we know it's imperfect, was. And then we see the stem of our verb, ride. So we know it's laughing or smiling. She was laughing. Salutabant, same way. You see the nt, they, ba, were, saluta, greeting. Salutabant, They were greeting. Let's try a few verbs in the imperfect, translating them. Think about them in your head before I bring out the answer and check to see if you were correct. Do you remember the verb gustat? Now we've added a ba to become gustabat. Try reading it backwards with me. T, that's singular, so he or she. Ba, that means was. And gusta, to taste. That means our answer is, he was tasting. Expectabant. NT, so we notice it's plural. We see our ba, and then we go to our verb. Expectabant. They were waiting for, or they were expecting. Redet. Right away, there is no ba in redet. I hope you spotted that yourself. What tense is redet? It's just the normal present tense, one you've seen so many times before. That means redet translates, she laughed, or he laughed. Salutabat. He, ba was, saluta, to greet. He was greeting. Wokabat. She was calling. Portat. No ba in this one again. He carried. See if we can create our own imperfect verb using she was watching. We can create it backwards here as well. I noticed the she, so I know I'm going to need a T. I see the was, so I bring in my ba. And my verb is watching, or to watch, specta. So I bring in the rest of my verb. She was watching, spectabat. The perfect tense uses different endings on verbs instead of just adding something. Have a look at these two verbs. Now you may notice right away that I have added a V to both of these, and that is true. Many verbs in the perfect tense have a V. We're going to talk more about that later. But notice especially the ending. Now we still have a T to show the singular, but what we really have is an IT to show the singular. In the plural, we have this whole long ending to show the perfect tense. Notice it still ends in an NT, but it has ERU at the beginning. Portawerent, they carried. Portavit, he carried. Remember that our V's sound like W's in Latin. Audivit, she heard. Salutawerent, they greeted. Often we can identify the perfect tense by looking for certain letters, like V in the verbs we just saw, X, and U. However, these are not always the indicators of the perfect tense. Remember I said the imperfect is easy because it's always the same and it always uses ba. But the perfect tense is not so constant. It depends on which conjugation the verbs belong to. Verbs of the same conjugation will always follow the same pattern. Verbs with an A, like portare, salutare, intrare, will always have a V. Verbs which in the present tense have an E, like teret, habet, will always have a U. And many of the third conjugation verbs use an X, like ducit, to lead, becomes duxit, he led. However, we can't always rely on these for the perfect tense. Portavit, he carried. Salutavit, she greeted. Intrawerent, they entered. Teruit, he terrified. Habuerent, they had. Duxit, she led. Now, as I said, we can't always look for these letters. We just have to memorize what the perfect form looks like versus what the present form looks like. Here's a few examples. Portat, becomes portawit. Here we can see the V. Habent becomes habuerent. Here we can see the U, and in the plural it's a little easier because we can see our erent ending. Salutant, salutaverent. Here's one that's a little trickier. Respondet, with an E, becomes respondit. The only change here is from just a T ending to an IT ending, so you'll have to pay special attention for verbs like that. Dicit becomes dixit. Sometimes it's almost impossible to tell. Then we must use context. Which tense makes sense in the sentence? Here are two examples of verbs that are identical in the present and the perfect. Venit, he comes, and venit, he came. Contendit, he hurries. Contendit, he hurried. Exactly the same. This is an instance where you need to use context. Of course, as I mentioned, it's easier to tell in the third person plural because you have the erent ending to fall back on. Veniunt, they come. Venerant, they came. Contendent, they hurry. Contenderunt, they hurried. Let's try categorizing a few of these verbs in Latin. The present tense, action that is happening now, and the perfect tense, action that is finished. Many of these verbs I hope you recognize. Ambulat, he walks, present tense. Dixerent, here see both the X and the erent ending. That indicates to us this is perfect. They spoke. Plaudavit, notice the V. He applauded. Amat, she loves. Ridet and recit. These are the present and perfect of the same verb. Ridet, he smiles. Recit, he smiled. Here's another pair. Current and cucurerent. They run. Cucurerent, they ran. Spectat, spectavit. The V helps us in this case. Spectat, she watches. Spectavit, she watched. Clamant, they shout. Expectat, they wait for, he waits for. Portavit, he carried. Vocavit, he called. Laudaverent, they praised. Now let's try the present, the imperfect, and the perfect, and see how it goes. Now, I'm doing the exercises for now, but later in this chapter, you'll have a chance to practice on your own in our textbook exercises on the website. Cucurit, he ran. Plaudabat, see the ba right there? They were applauding. Remember to use the two-word verb for the imperfect tense. Clamavit, he shouted. Timebant, again we see the ba. They were frightened. Habet, she had. Recit, he smiled. Curit, not the same as cucurit. This is the present tense. She runs. Expectabant, notice the he was waiting for. Ades. Now here we want to fall back on our verb to be, which is hidden here in our verb, ades. This is the present tense. He is here. Portat, she carried. Venerant, this is one of our tricky verbs, but we see the erent ending. They came. Scribet, he writes. Audivit, she listened. Vocabat, he was calling. Laudabant, they were praising. Scripsit, he wrote. Now this is a tricky one because remember that in the present tense it looks like this, scribet. But in the perfect, it doesn't have an X or a V to help us out, just that IT ending and a change in the verb stem. Amawit, he loved. Spectawerant, they watched. Let's try a few perfect verbs in translation. Remember, reading backwards can still help us with the perfect tense. Gustavit, I see the T and also the V that helps me know it's perfect tense. And I remember that gusta is taste. So my translation, he tasted. Expectavit, she expected. Recitawerant, they recited. Salutavit, she greeted. Wokawerant, they called. Pulsavit, he punched. Let's try to develop our own perfect verb. She watched. Since it's singular, I know I'm going to need a T. In this case, this verb uses a V to indicate the perfect tense. So I'm going to put in a VIT as my ending. My verb, to watch, specto. So my verb becomes spectavit. Now you know 3 different verb tenses in Latin: the present, the imperfect, and the perfect. Have a look at these 2 verbs where you can see all 3 tenses at once. To praise, we can see the present, laudat, the imperfect, laudabat, and the perfect, laudavit. Here with the verb to watch, we can see it in the plural. Spectant, they watch. Spectabant, they were watching. And spectawerant, they watched. As a last note, remember again that the verb to be is always irregular in Latin and in most other languages. So when we want to say he was or they were in the past tense, we use erat, he was, and erant, they were, instead of est, he is, and sunt, they are. So keep your eyes peeled for those verbs. Our next video goes over the cartoons in stage 6. So go to the next one when you're sure you understand the imperfect and perfect tenses.